Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I am BurnCrewSP and welcome once again to one of those videos where I nerd out about all games that have the special power of decimating your patience in record time. So, following the topic of one of my most recent videos, in which I expressed my feelings about the accessibility of the MegaMan franchise, I wondered if I said the NES MegaMan games are not as insanely tough as some of its console companions, then which one of them are actually really hard games? And more importantly, which of them are worth your time and efforts? Because when discussing hard games, most of the stuff I've seen online mostly focus on the difficulty aspect of these classics from the past. However, considering how you might need to sink some time into these tall cookies, I wanted to analyze them and find out if some of those very well-known games actually deserve your free time. And then I suddenly had a topic to go on for about 40 minutes. The magic of the creative process is quite quirky, isn't it? So yeah, here's a video about 4 specific video games from the NES library that never fail to make me sweat, but also never make me feel like I'm wasting my time. One very small disclaimer I need to address before going any further is that I am aware that difficulty is a very subjective topic, so I will be doing my best to try and explain why these 4 entries are truly hard no matter who you are. Okay then, I hope you are all comfy behind that screen, because I am about to dive in. Let's go! There is no better way to start one of these lists than the quintessential difficult game of the 80s. Ghosts and Goblins arrived in 1986 for Japan and the US, and then 3 years later in Europe, being one of the very first games made by Capcom on the system, despite being programmed by Macronix and not them. The game puts players in the shoes of Sir Arthur, a knight in shining armor whose adventure starts after the devil kidnaps Princess Primprin. Even if the plot is not groundbreaking at all, the main mechanics definitely are, though I would label them as bone-breaking instead. With it being an action side-scroller, the challenge of Ghosts and Goblins is all about running, jumping, and defeating enemies on your way to the end of this stage, where a massive monster will try to stop Sir Arthur from getting to the next area. Even if it may sound pretty simple, you'll only need 5 seconds of playtime to understand that the sayings are indeed true, and this is a Nintendo hard game, as they say. However, despite being compared to Dark Souls, just like almost everything nowadays, the challenge that this game offers is vastly different. Yes, the element of trial and error and unforgiving level design is right there, but the one detail that makes this game stand out even today is how the placements of some elements are randomized. And this is shown to the player as soon as the game starts, with the presence of zombies at the cemetery. This means that rather than memorizing the levels from start to finish, quick reflexes and understanding the physics of the controls are the key to victory. At least for the most part, since each level has a different degree of both types of enemy designs. As a quick example, the first stage is all about randomized enemies, except for Firebrand the Gargoyle and the Monstrous Vines. But then the second stage is mostly about enemies with set patterns, with upcoming levels combining both types to create an insanely complex challenge. Despite the fact that Sir Arthur dies in 2 hits, the game does remain fair to the player, thanks to infinite continues and a few secret power-ups and weapons that might help you out along the way. On the contrary, something that will definitely not help you out is the stylish trickery that Ghosts and Goblins has in store for those who dare pick up the controller. Stuff like forcing you into a very bad weapon if you follow the wrong steps when traversing a stage, having to beat the game twice in a row to actually see the ending, and the funniest of all, forcing players to beat the devil with the shield, or else the game will respond with "Nah-uh" and send Sir Arthur back to level 5. Which, by the way, feels like a massive punch in the gut, considering how hard the last two levels are. These are the only areas in the game that share the same setting, this being Astaroth's castle. While stage 5 is a pretty tough climb, with some new enemy types thrown among gargoyles, ogres and the whole package essentially, stage 6 combines a boss rush with some similar design elements. And on top of that, using the shield on the devil is required, so that means completing about 80% of the level with a short range weapon. Yeah, it sounds much easier said than done, eh? Although, one aspect of Ghosts and Goblins that I don't hear people talking about as often is how bad the NES version is. Being a port of an arcade game released during the console's first years, that was also outsourced to a different company, it's understandable for the cracks to show up nowadays. Stuff like unresponsive controls, choppy frame rate, and your usual NES jank. So you might be wondering why I decided to recommend this game despite these issues, and the thing is, I'm gonna cheat at my own rules and tell you all to play the arcade version instead. The original coin on board retains the exact same challenge, same weapons, same levels, but with much better graphics, responsive controls, and a few secrets that were removed in the NES version. Now, on the topic of hardcore platformers, Castlevania 3 is not only one of the best, but also the toughest entries on the system's library. After the experimental feel of Simon's Quest, Konami went back to the drawing board, and in 1989, Japan saw the release of Akumajo Densetsu, the result of a combination of the best aspects of past entries, as well as introducing some excellent additions to the formula, like the multiple partners you can recruit along the adventure. And nowadays, just like the original 1986 game, Dracula's Curse is considered to be one of the most relentless games ever made. However, while Castlevania 1 was a pretty short game, to the point where an experienced player can complete Simon's journey in about 25 minutes, the final game of the NES trilogy is a much larger game. Thus, getting to see the end is a whole different ordeal. The length of the adventure is also amplified by the multiple routes that players can choose during their travels, leading to a very different set of levels, as well as giving access to a specific companion. For example, after clearing the first half of the second level, Trevor Belmont can either continue through the forest to rescue Syphable Nades, or make his way into the swamp, which leads to the cave where Alucard is sealed. While this structure of the game has received some welcome changes, the main mechanics have not changed that much compared to previous entries. But that's not a bad thing at all. Jumping and whipping enemies feels great thanks to the simplicity and responsiveness of the controls. I have heard complaints about how all characters except for Grant have a fixed jump arc, which means that once your feet leave the ground, there is no way back. Even if this sounds terrifying on paper, every level is designed with this control scheme in mind, so I have never seen it as an issue. In fact, I'd argue it benefits the experience, since every challenge is built up with the character's limitations in mind. Every obstacle feels like a very small riddle, and finding the solution brings a level of satisfaction that not many games can accomplish. Stuff like calculating your jumps properly, timing your attacks accordingly to counterattack enemy patterns, and using your sub-weapons to aid your way once the whip is not enough. Managing all of these things at once is pure adrenaline. You know, the kind of stuff that makes my two brain cells actually connect for once. This strategic playstyle is also encouraged by the game, like how, for example, Trevor Belmont upgrades both his whip and sub-weapons by breaking candles and attacking enemies respectively. These upgrades create a feeling of momentum per se, because the longer you stay alive, the stronger the vampire hunter will become, and so wise decisions will lead to great outcomes. On the flip side, this design philosophy also showcases how severe the punishment is when you actually slip up. With both characters back to square one when it comes to power-ups, some checkpoints can become quite a hassle, since you have to pick up your tools before trying again, and that's not always granted. This is especially apparent as the game goes on, since later levels can be quite long, and kicking the bucket at an unfortunate place can lead to players suffering way more after trying again from the checkpoint, because the momentum I was talking about before is suddenly brought to a halt. It's like a domino effect. Okay, so it's time to discuss the elephant in the room, the knockback. This is a very well-known feature of the older Castlevania games. It's very simple. After taking a hit, the character you're playing as will be launched back by the impact. In most cases, this is nothing to be worried about, since it's a natural way to push players away from the enemy. In other cases, it can lead to falling into a bottomless pit. This situation has led people to think that the health bar does not matter at all in the last few levels, since one single hit equals one extra life going out the window. However, I feel like it's quite the opposite case, especially on the overseas version of the game. Just like in Castlevania 1, enemies will increase their damage output as the game goes on, capping at 4 points of health per hit after you get to stage 7. This feature was not present in the original Japanese cartridge, and it's definitely one of the main reasons why the difficulty curve starts ramping up during the last stretch of the adventure. By being able to just take 4 hits, sections like the stair climb in level 9 or the multiple phases of endgame boss fights become a much greater challenge. Despite this, I feel like the difficulty curve is very well made, with a progressive increase in challenge as you get closer and closer to Dracula. Though that is, if you take the path through the forest. The cave path, commonly known as the Alucard route, has way harder stages, with level 5 having probably the most difficult section in the entire game if you don't know what you're doing. Although, even with its flaws, Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse is one of my favorite games on the NES. The gameplay becomes immensely enjoyable as soon as you get a basic understanding of what your main characters can do. The multiple paths offer a ton of replayability, the soundtrack is amazing, and the sprite work and environment design is quite exquisite. And so, I feel like this is a must play if you're looking for a fun, yet cruel video game. Now, trying to pinpoint where an RPG is very difficult is usually no easy task, especially if you go back to the classics, since compared to nowadays, battle mechanics used to be way more simple. And so, if a boss or a dungeon felt like too much for the capabilities of your squad, grinding used to be the perfect solution. Either that, or buying 99 heal potions. However, Final Fantasy III might be one of the exceptions to the rule. No, not that Final Fantasy, I mean this one. The original third entry of Square's indispensable saga of role-playing games was released back in 1990, though only Japanese players had the chance to actually experience it. It wasn't until 2006 that FF3 crossed the oceans in the form of a remake for the Nintendo DS. Despite the presence of the Pixel remaster and this DS remake, to play the Famicom release, you'll need to resort to fan translations even today. After the mixed reception of its predecessor, the last game of the franchise within the console that brought it to life went back to basics. Not only is the story less prominent, with silent protagonists and a plot that's more about the journey rather than the events that take place during it, but also the way your characters level up
was simplified compared to Final Fantasy II. The battle system, however, expands on what the first Final Fantasy game cemented 3 years earlier. Sorcery went back to spell charges instead of MP. However, in this game you get way more slots, and thanks to the presence of restoration points instead of dungeons, the pacing is much better. Not only that, but instead of restricting yourself to the same character classes for the whole adventure, you can change them at any time thanks to the inclusion of the job system. Also, there are way more jobs to choose from, and each one of them has a special perk, like the Geomancer's ability to use the terrain to their advantage, the Jump of the Dragoon, or the Fear Fists of the Black Belt. On the negative side of things, some jobs are more useful than others, to the point where by the end of the game, the Ninja and the Sage are way better than any other class. The new dungeons do not overstay their welcome, the navigation is mostly simple, and enemy encounters never become too annoying to deal with. For the most part, at least. So here's the big question you might be asking. Why bother with this older version when the remakes look better and added some quality of life improvements? Well, I always felt like the old school Final Fantasy games offered a degree of challenge that was very unique, thanks to the spell charge system and the wide variety of job combinations you can use for your party. To successfully make it out of a dungeon, players will need to prepare accordingly and develop an effective strategy. Granted, this can become frustrating, since it may involve some trial and error, and the solution to some of these fights are very specific, but aside from that, I find it to be really fun. Since you cannot save until you exit the dungeon, there is a risk versus reward element to this. Imagine for a moment that you are running low on resources. Do you press on and try to reach the end, or do you warp outside, heal up and prepare a more efficient strategy with the new weapons you gather along the way? This is what Final Fantasy III is all about, and thanks to the surprising level of polish across the whole adventure, the game presents a difficulty curve that feels tough, but never unfair. That is, until you get to the devilish combo of the Crystal Tower and the Dark World back to back. I won't lie to you, those two final levels are easily the worst part of the game, so feel free to use save states here, I'm sure no one will blame you for it. That aside, I find it to be impressive that Square managed to make such a complex game back in 1990, and even though its sequels improved on some of its aspects, there is a charm to this game that I think only Final Fantasy V managed to replicate. And since it's not that long of an RPG, with about 20 or 30 hours of runtime, I heavily recommend you to give this one a go. And in case you're a rookie when it comes to role-playing games, the early parts of the adventure are easygoing and I think you can get some enjoyment out of this even if you're new to the genre. Oh boy, it was about time I brought up this game. Let's go. Battletoads might be one of Rareware's most well-known pieces of work, aside from, Banjo-Kazooie and their contributions to the Donkey Kong Country series. The story behind this game follows the duo of Rash and Sets, two anthropomorphic toads with sunglasses who need to rescue their third partner, Pimple, as well as Princess Angelica from the clutches of the evil Dark Queen and her minions. Even if character designs are obviously inspired by the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, who also had a pretty tough game for the system by the way, they all have enough personality to not be considered one of those rip-offs that try to cash in on the popularity of the Turtles. Things like how the Toads' arms and stretch in cartoony ways when fighting enemies, or the exaggerated surprise faces they put out in multiple situations. They have a lot of charm. As for the game itself, every single stage has a vastly different feel to it, not only in its atmosphere, but also in its gameplay. 1 second you'll be playing an isometric stage with beat'em up mechanics, then the next level may be fully based on 2D platforming, and then the next one adds surfing to the table, or the board. Get it? Okay, that pun wasn't worth laughing at, but do you know what isn't a laughing matter either? This game's difficulty curve. The first 2 levels are manageable for the most part, but once you're done with them, you gain access to Turbo Tunnel. And this one stage is easily the most recognizable part of the original Battletoads game. Why, you ask? Because of the bike section, which takes up around 80% of the whole thing. The concept is very simple: dodge the walls, enemies and pitfalls, and survive until you reach the end. However, the bike will gradually increase its speed after you cross a checkpoint, and by the end of the level, you'll need pretty amazing reflexes to dodge whatever the game throws at you. And even if it feels very simple to understand, to say that this level is one of the most egregious acts of audiovisual violence towards the player will be a massive understatement. And the silly, funny thing is that this is just the 3rd out of 12 levels. And the game does not let up after these either. Although, one of the reasons why I think Battletoads offers a very unique challenge is how, because all the levels are very different in mechanics, theme and purpose, the fellow holding the controller will need to quickly adapt to each zone, just to safely make it through. And that is very cool, honestly. I have yet to see another game that takes the multi-genre approach this far. One flaw with that design choice though is how this game lacks unlimited continues, with players being only given 3 tries before being kicked back to the title screen after a game over. And yeah, you could argue that the warp zones definitely help with that issue, but getting to them can be pretty difficult by itself, and hilariously enough, there is no way to skip the Turbo Tunnel. Accidentally or not, by not allowing players to keep trying, getting to the end becomes a much greater ordeal. With all of those flaws on the table, you might wonder why I consider Battletoads as an experience that's worth your time. And the thing is, I can't help but recommend it, because it might be one of the most unique games ever released for the NES, thanks to how unconventional the level design is for the entirety of the adventure. Not even later games of the franchise can get close to the original in this aspect. And besides, with Battletoads having this legendary reputation as an insanely hard game, being successful at reaching the ending feels even better. Alright, I guess that's gonna be the end for now, so let's wrap this up, okay? These 4 games have been discussed countless times across the internet, often brought up whenever a list of the hottest games ever made is made. And it's true, the challenge that they offer is truly immense. But despite that though, I don't feel like that should be enough reason to scare people away from them. Even if some of their aspects have been eroded by the passage of time, since the evolution of video games isn't a slow process to say the least, there is much more to these relics of the past than what you might think. The methodic gameplay of Castlevania 3, the variety of Battletoads, or the strategic dungeon crawling of Final Fantasy 3, all of those traits make up for some genuinely fun games, which is why I think they are still worth your time, even after 30 years since they saw the light of day. So, if after watching this video I managed to actually convince you to give this a shot, there are a few ways to find them aside from using an emulator, except for Final Fantasy 3. Ghosts and Goblins is part of Capcom Arcade Stadium, and the NES version can be played for free on the company's official website. On the topic of Castlevania 3, It was included in the Castlevania Anniversary Collection, along with the rest of the classic entries of the franchise. And last but not least, the Battletoads original game is available through Rare Replay on Xbox consoles. So before signing off, I must mention that this video was supposed to have a fifth entry I was going to talk about. But in the end, I noticed how that game didn't deserve to be an entry on this list. No, it deserves a video of its own, because it might be one of the most obscure gems hidden among the thousands of games released for the Nintendo Entertainment System. But we'll get to that eventually. As for now, just give this a try, or in case you have played them already, maybe I was able to give you a different perspective. Either way, the conclusion I always come to whenever I tackle all video games like these is that just because the industry has moved away from the design choices that gave birth to these titles, it doesn't mean that they should be discarded or forgotten forever. That is why there are games nowadays that try to build up upon them. Because it's true that they may not be as advanced or polished as their successors, but they are indeed small pieces of video game history. This is Burger SP, and as always, thank you for watching. Okay, so we have reached that point of the video where I just give my unscripted farewell. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I sincerely hope that you guys give a shot to these games. And in case you do, please let me know. I'll be looking forward to seeing your reaction to some of the stuff that's hidden in between these games. Holy cow. Anyways, if you liked what you just saw, please let me know and then consider subscribing. You guys have given me a massive amount of support. I would have never expected to get this far, so now that I am here, then I will keep striving to improve on my work. So yeah, guess I'm here to stay, for better or for worse. Anyways, this is gonna be the end for now, so please make sure to take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!